we're at the part where the story stops being about a tense meeting in a hotel suite and starts becoming about structural power. Because what happened inside that room at the Four Seasons was dramatic, yes. But what's unfolding in the markets right now? What's unfolding in cabinet offices and corporate boardrooms and central banks? That's the real story. That's where the consequences live. Because when West Texas Intermediate jumps more than 11% in under half an hour, traders are not reacting to personality. They are reacting to risk. And risk in energy markets is about continuity. It's about whether the molecules keep moving. Pipelines don't care about press releases. Refineries don't care about political theater. They care about throughput. They care about certainty. And what Mark Carney did, very deliberately, was introduce uncertainty into a system that depends on predictability. He didn't cut supply. He didn't threaten an embargo. He didn't hold a press conference announcing retaliation. He simply froze expansion. And in commodity economics, freezing growth in a tight market is the same thing as tightening supply. Because here's the part that doesn't make it into the shouting matches. North American energy integration is not theoretical. It is physical. It is steel in the ground. It is long-term contracts. It is refineries in the Midwest that are specifically configured for heavy Canadian crude. You cannot just swap that out overnight for light sweet crude from somewhere else. The chemistry is different. The refining processes are calibrated. The infrastructure is designed around that specific input. So when Canada says no new capacity, what they're really saying is that the margin for error just disappeared. Now, let's widen the lens. For decades, the U.S.-Canada energy relationship has functioned on something close to autopilot. It has survived different presidents, different prime ministers, different parties, different recessions. Because it was rooted in mutual dependency and mutual benefit, the U.S. needed secure, proximate supply. Canada needed a massive, stable buyer. It was boring. And in geopolitics, boring is gold. What happened in that suite was the introduction of volatility into what used to be boring. And volatility changes behavior. Investors, as we said, have already started recalculating. Pension funds do not like political risk layered on top of commodity risk. Sovereign wealth funds do not like frameworks that can be rewritten at the last minute. If the perception settles in that American agreements are provisional, that they are subject to sudden revision based on ego or leverage, capital will demand a premium. And premiums translate into higher costs. Higher costs translate into higher consumer prices. That's not ideology. That's math. Meanwhile, on the geopolitical side, Europe is watching this with laser focus. Germany, still recalibrating after the collapse of its dependence on Russian gas, has been aggressively diversifying suppliers. Canadian LNG is attractive precisely because it is politically stable. Japan and South Korea, energy importers with virtually no domestic fossil resources, prioritize reliability above almost everything else. If Canada signals long-term commitment to those markets, infrastructure will follow. Terminals will be financed. Shipping lanes will be optimized. Contracts will be signed. And as we said earlier, infrastructure is destiny. Once billions are spent orienting export capacity east and west instead of south, inertia sets in. Trade flows calcify. Political alliances deepen around those flows. The U.S. would not simply be negotiating over price anymore. It would be negotiating over lost positioning. Now, what about retaliation? If tariffs are imposed, they don't operate in a vacuum. A 25% tariff on Canadian energy would not magically make domestic supply appear. It would increase input costs for refineries, utilities, manufacturers. Those costs ripple outward. Inflation, which central banks have spent years trying to tame, reasserts itself. The Federal Reserve is forced into a defensive posture, rate hikes or delayed cuts. Markets respond, credit tightens, growth slows. And suddenly, what began as a negotiating gambit becomes macroeconomic drag. There is also a legal dimension. Emergency override authority, the clause that reportedly triggered the walkout, touches sovereignty at its core. Allowing a foreign government the ability to seize operational control of infrastructure, even under emergency justification, is not a minor concession. It's a structural subordination. No G7 nation agrees to that lightly. Carney's rejection was not emotional. It was constitutional. And here's the strategic subtlety. By walking out, rather than escalating immediately, Carney preserved optionality. He can return to the table if terms normalize. He can pivot outward if they don't. He applied pressure without closing doors. Trump, by contrast, framed the standoff as binary: accept the new terms or lose access. That framing assumes dependency runs one direction. The data suggests otherwise. Let's talk about New England specifically. The Northeast Corridor's natural gas infrastructure is constrained. Environmental opposition has slowed new domestic pipeline construction for years. As a result, winter supply peaks rely heavily on Canadian imports. If expansion freezes, the cushion disappears. Utilities will hedge aggressively. Hedging drives futures higher. Futures feed into retail pricing. Consumers feel it. And in politics, heating bills are visceral. Voters do not parse trade frameworks. They look at their thermostat and their monthly statement. If that statement spikes, they assign blame. Whether that blame is fair or simplified does not matter. It lands. Midwestern gasoline markets are similarly exposed. Refineries optimized for Canadian heavy crude would face tighter margins. Tight margins equal higher pump prices. The memory of 2008 still lingers in political psychology. $9 regional gasoline is not just an economic statistic. It's a narrative accelerant. Now, zoom out even further. Trust. For 70-plus years, U.S. foreign policy leverage has rested not only on economic size or military strength, but on perceived reliability. Allies might disagree with Washington, but they generally believed agreements would hold. If that belief erodes, hedging behavior increases. Allies diversify, they sign parallel agreements, they cultivate alternative supply chains. China understands this instinctively. Energy diplomacy is one of its core strategic tools. If Beijing sees an opening to deepen resource ties with Ottawa, it will move quickly. Not necessarily to displace the U.S. entirely, but to create leverage. And leverage, once distributed, rarely reconsolidates neatly. Inside Washington, the reaction is likely already fragmented. Energy executives are calculating losses. Governors of colder states are evaluating exposure. Congressional leadership is reading futures screens. Pressure, as noted earlier, may not come from opposition voices, but from allies who fear economic fallout. Which brings us to the political calculus. If this escalates into visible price spikes, the narrative shifts from abstract sovereignty disputes to kitchen table economics. Inflation fatigue is real. Consumers who have endured years of elevated costs are not patient with new shocks. An energy-driven spike heading into an election cycle would be combustible. So what are the plausible endgames? An emergency retreat remains possible. Quiet diplomacy. Face-saving language. A reframed memorandum that restores parity. Markets would calm, futures would retrace. Investors would breathe, though with caution. But the memory of volatility would linger, embedding a modest but permanent risk premium. A spiral, however, is not theoretical. Tariffs beget countermeasures. Regulatory slowdowns, legal disputes, WTO filings. Each layer thickens the fog. Markets despise fog. And then there is the structural pivot scenario. The slow reorientation of Canadian export infrastructure away from overwhelming U.S. concentration. Not an overnight severing, but a gradual diversification. Over time, dependency ratios shift. Influence ratios shift with them. The question at the heart of this moment is not whether one meeting collapsed. Meetings collapse all the time. The question is whether this represents a transient rupture or a doctrinal shift in how North America manages interdependence. Because interdependence, properly handled, is stabilizing. Mishandled, it becomes leverage warfare. Carney's posture signals a willingness to redefine the terms of that interdependence. Trump's posture signals a willingness to test its limits. Markets have already cast their preliminary vote. Volatility up, currencies adjusting, futures spiking. The next signals to watch are quieter. Diplomatic traffic between Ottawa and Brussels. Statements from U.S. governors in exposed states. Whether back-channel envoys appear, whether language softens or hardens, energy is rarely just about energy. It is about power in every sense of the word. If this resolves quickly, it will be remembered as a dramatic negotiating episode. If it does not, historians may mark it as the inflection point where North American energy certainty gave way to competitive recalibration. Right now, the molecules are still flowing. The lights are still on. The thermostats are still set. But the architecture underneath them just shifted. And once architecture shifts, everything built on top of it feels the tremor. And here is where the story stops being about reaction and starts being about consequence. Because the immediate shock, the market spike, the currency movement, the emergency calls between trade ministers, that was the surface disturbance. What's forming underneath is slower, heavier, and potentially far more enduring. When alliances are tested over something as foundational as energy, the real shift doesn't happen in the press room. It happens in the spreadsheets of long-term planners. It happens in feasibility studies. It happens in 20-year contracts drafted quietly while television panels are still debating who stormed out of which room. And if you talk to energy economists off the record, in the cautious language they use when they know political volatility is in the air, they will tell you this: reliability is currency. Once spent, it takes years to rebuild. The United States and Canada have built one of the most integrated energy systems on Earth. Pipelines crossing the border aren't symbolic, they're arteries. Electricity grids are synchronized. Refineries in the American Midwest are calibrated specifically for Canadian heavy crude. Natural gas infrastructure in the Northeast depends on Canadian supply during peak winter demand. This isn't a casual trade relationship. It's structural interdependence. So when that interdependence becomes a bargaining chip, even rhetorically, it forces a recalculation, and recalculation is expensive. If Canada continues to freeze expansion and redirect future investment toward European and Asian buyers, the immediate impact may be modest. Existing contracts will still be honored. Current flows won't simply vanish. But the margin for growth, the cushion that absorbs shocks, shrinks. Markets price margins. That's why futures moved so aggressively. Traders weren't responding to a single meeting. They were pricing in the possibility that the growth trajectory of North American energy cooperation just bent. Now consider what happens if tariffs materialize. A 25% tariff on Canadian energy doesn't function as punishment in isolation. It acts as a tax on American refiners and utilities. That cost flows downstream. Higher input costs mean tighter refining margins. Tighter margins mean higher gasoline prices. Utilities facing higher natural gas costs pass them along to ratepayers. And ratepayers vote? Energy inflation is uniquely political because it is universal. It hits commuters, small businesses, farmers, logistics companies. It compounds other inflationary pressures. It doesn't stay confined to a policy white paper. There's also the monetary angle. If energy-driven inflation resurges, the Federal Reserve finds itself in a bind. Cut rates to stimulate growth and risk fueling price increases, or hold rates higher for longer and risk slowing the economy. Financial markets do not like policy dilemmas. They like clarity. And clarity, right now, is in short supply. But perhaps the most consequential piece of this story isn't domestic at all. It's global positioning. Europe has been methodically reducing dependence on unstable suppliers. The trauma of disrupted Russian gas flows reshaped its entire energy doctrine. Canada, with its political stability and vast reserves, represents something close to ideal for European planners. Democratic alignment, rule of law, predictable contract enforcement. If Ottawa accelerates LNG export infrastructure aimed at Europe, those relationships deepen institutionally. Financing flows. Joint ventures form. Diplomatic ties strengthen around shared energy security goals. And once those ties are reinforced, reversing them isn't simple. Asia is watching too. Japan and South Korea are among the world's most energy-dependent advanced economies. Reliability is existential for them. If Canada signals strategic diversification, Asian buyers will move to secure long-term supply. They don't wait for volatility to settle, they hedge against it. Which raises the quiet but unavoidable question. If Canada diversifies away from overwhelming U.S. concentration, does Washington's leverage shrink proportionally? Interdependence cuts both ways. But if one partner appears willing to weaponize that interdependence, the other partner has incentive to dilute it. There's also the institutional damage to consider. For decades, North American trade disputes were managed through established frameworks, panels, arbitration, structured negotiation. Even during heated disagreements, there was a sense of procedural stability. If disputes now move toward unilateral threats and emergency override clauses, institutional trust erodes. Institutional erosion rarely makes headlines. It shows up years later, when cooperation that once took weeks now takes months. And then there's the domestic political dimension in Canada. Mark Carney, facing his own political landscape, cannot be seen as capitulating on sovereignty. The reported emergency override demand, allowing a foreign government operational control during declared emergencies, touches a constitutional nerve. Rejecting it is not merely strategic. It's foundational. Any Canadian Prime Minister would face severe backlash for appearing to concede that authority. So compromise space narrows on both sides, which means the path to de-escalation, if it exists, likely runs through reframing rather than reversal. language shifts, clarifications, a quiet removal of the most controversial clauses, face-saving rhetoric for domestic audiences. That's how diplomatic ruptures often heal. But healing requires mutual incentive. And here's the political risk calculus inside Washington. If energy prices spike heading into an election cycle, the narrative shifts rapidly. It stops being about leverage and starts being about cost of living. It stops being about negotiating strength and starts being about household budgets. Economic memory is short, but price sensitivity is immediate. Governors in colder states, senators from manufacturing-heavy regions, agricultural stakeholders dependent on diesel pricing, these actors exert influence. Pressure doesn't always come from opponents. Sometimes it comes from allies worried about re-election. Meanwhile, financial markets will continue to function as a kind of referendum. Currency movements reflect capital's judgment about stability. If the U.S. dollar weakens against commodity-linked currencies during prolonged trade tension, that's not symbolic. It's investment capital hedging against unpredictability. And unpredictability has a cost. There is also the long game. If Canada, over the next decade, incrementally builds eastbound and westbound export capacity, the United States will still buy Canadian energy. Geography guarantees that. But the asymmetry diminishes. Canada becomes less dependent on a single buyer. The U.S. becomes one of several major customers, rather than the overwhelmingly dominant one. That shift wouldn't be dramatic. It would be gradual. But gradual shifts are often the most permanent. Think about how supply chains reoriented after the pandemic. At first, it was emergency rerouting. Then it became diversification policy. Then it became embedded corporate doctrine. Once diversification becomes doctrine, it doesn't revert easily. Energy flows could follow a similar arc. Now imagine, 5 years from now, historians looking back. They won't focus on the optics of a walkout. They'll examine whether this was the moment when North American energy cooperation began transitioning from implicit trust to cautious hedging. They'll ask whether leverage tactics accelerated a partner's diversification strategy. They'll ask whether short-term negotiating posture produced long-term structural dilution of influence. And perhaps most importantly, they'll examine whether domestic political gain outweighed strategic cost. Right now, the molecules are still moving. Tankers are still loading. Pipelines are still pressurized. Contracts are still valid. But the assumptions underpinning them are less certain than they were before that meeting began. The difference between a temporary rupture and a lasting realignment often comes down to what happens next, whether cooler calculations prevail, whether economic stakeholders assert pressure, whether diplomatic channels quietly stitch together a revised framework. If de-escalation happens quickly, markets will stabilize. Futures will retrace. The episode will become a cautionary tale about brinkmanship in integrated systems. If it doesn't, and if diversification accelerates as a defensive posture, the consequences will be subtle but enduring. Less leverage, higher risk premiums, slower cooperation. Energy, at its core, is about continuity. Interruptions, real or perceived, force systems to adapt. And once systems adapt, they rarely return entirely to their previous form. So this isn't just about a meeting, or even about tariffs. It's about whether the most integrated bilateral energy relationship in the world can withstand the introduction of strategic volatility without permanently altering its foundation. That's the story now unfolding, not in headlines alone, but in capital allocation decisions, in infrastructure planning committees, in long-term supply contracts being drafted with slightly different assumptions than they were a month ago. And those assumptions, more than any press statement, will determine what North American energy politics looks like for the next generation.